Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, so thank you very much for joining us here today for this Birmingham Business School lecture on place matters, unlocking the growing global puzzle of inequality. It is with a special excitement that I'm pleased to welcome the Fulbright Distinguished Research Chair and colleague, Professor Stephan Weiler, to our school lecture series. Stephan Weiler holds the William Morgan Endowed Chair as Professor of Economics at Colorado State University. He received his Bachelor in Economics and Master in Development Economics from Stanford University in 1988, and his Economics PhD from Berkeley University in 1994, where he studied with the Nobel laureate George Akerlof. He was Assistant Vice President and Economist at the Federal Reserve Center for the Study of Rural America, where he led the center's applied research from 2004 to 2006. Stephan has worked broadly on regional economic development issues, combining theoretical, empirical, and policy analysis on topics broader topics such as information, innovation, industrial restructuring, land use, public-private partnerships, immigration, entrepreneurship, and the environment. But particularly, he has focused in innovating economic bridges between the rural and urban areas, leveraging a geographic form of Akerlof's informational asymmetries. And this perspective shaped his role as founding research director of the Colorado Innovation Network. He is distilling these 3 decades of experience as founding director of the Regional Economic Development Institute at Colorado State University. This institute is a partnering institute with City-REDI here at the University of Birmingham. There he provides fresh, timely, and cutting-edge information to enhance economic growth and development prospects for regions across the globe. This partnership between City-REDI at Colorado State and City-REDI here in Birmingham has somehow helped to make the basis for his recent selection as a Fulbright Distinguished Research Chair to further develop these interrelationships between these 2 institutes in 2018-2019. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stephan Weiler. Thank you very much.
So now let me check. Can you hear me, particularly in back? Yes. These handy devices. Thanks very much, Raquel, for the introduction. And thank you all for being here and for the opportunity to discuss some pretty big ideas. It's somewhat rare. I mean, academics, we have, it's a wonderful career with unbelievable flexibility. And you get to choose your hours. You can work whatever 80 hours a week you want to. But this opportunity it's rare to have an opportunity to step back and get a big picture of thinking about what one has done. And 3 decades is roughly about the time I've been thinking about these things. And so I haven't had a chance yet to really think through sort of how the pieces fit together. And so that's what this lecture is about. It's sort of it's about the big picture. I want to thank, obviously, Fulbright. As it turns out, I mean, this university has a long legacy of sciences, but I believe I'm the first social science distinguished chair, which I think is actually tribute to my hosts, both the business school and to City-REDI, in recognition of what they're doing on the cutting edge. And I hope that my time here and our future relationship helps to add to that. So I'm going to talk about the global inequality puzzle, and let me be. There is going to be sort of global perspectives. But by humility, I am going to focus on what I know best, namely the United States. But what I'm looking forward to in the question and answers and discussions is for you folks to teach me something about not only the UK and the West Midlands, which in fact I've been learning about over the last 4 months. So that will be the topic for discussion. Please come on in. The irony also is a little bit, I mean, today is May Day, and it's interesting, I mean, when I'm talking about inequality, We're talking largely about inequality in terms of the bottom tier being working class and labor. And so it's interesting coming and speaking to you from the one country on the planet that there's very few countries on the planet that don't celebrate May Day. We have our very own Labor Day in September, which is just the official end of summer. But I think there's something to the fact that labor is the focus here and it's often gotten short shrift. I will talk about that in my presentation as well. I'd be happy to answer any clarifying questions as we go. I'm going to leave any more substantive questions for the discussion, so sort of to keep on pace. But again, if there's anything that's unclear, please don't hesitate. So, REDI at CSU, just briefly, and I'll have a slide at the very end about that. It was very intentional. It was named with respect to our senior institute, namely City-REDI. When I was thinking about using this Morgan chair to develop this institute, it was just the beginning of our relationship. And so the moniker, the name, is in fact a tribute to, I think, the relationship as well. All right, so what about this inequality? Since I've been studying the economics of place, or what they call economic geography, spatial economics, rural economics, regional economics, many different terms, in some ways from the very start. And part of the reason was because economics, I think, is a very powerful discipline. Sometimes it can use a little humility itself. But I think there are some really powerful tools, both theoretical and empirical, analytical, that can tell you a lot. But what I was always amazed by in my undergraduate and graduate courses was that the question of where never shows up anywhere. It's been a marginalized field. It has a long history in Europe. In fact, I went to school for much of my early life in Europe, and I ended up taking geography classes, not something I would have never done if I had been in the States the entire time. And that's when I started studying economics, both in high school and then in college, we are good at prices, we're good at costs and margins, we're good at quantifying all kinds of things, but we very rarely talk about place. What do we talk about? We split the discipline into two features: macroeconomics, the national economy, all right? Things like national income, the national unemployment rate, for instance. And then we talk about individual markets, like the markets for car hires, for Uber, for instance, versus taxis, those sorts of things. But the question of where is nowhere in there. And what I'm going to propose is that this is a way of linking the two in a way that I think is valuable to the entire discipline. And the other part was a bit of complacency because places were converging. And I'll just demonstrate that. Regional convergence in the United States was a factor right until the 1980s, and I can show you what it looked like, basically. Here's the level of income in 1940. This is the same for right up to 1980. So lower income places very clearly grew faster, okay? That was a very tight relationship. But that broke down very significantly in 1980. This is what the relationship looks like now, all right? It's actually, the richer places actually grow somewhat faster, and it's much more dispersed, you'll notice. And that is a remarkable feature, a remarkable turnaround in a relatively short period of time. And I'll come back to, for example, Thomas Piketty and others who've talked about the change that occurred, but I think that's a fairly stark contrast. And in some ways, it kicks out the excuse of not worrying about place. So that's our youngest member of the audience, who I'm delighted is joining us. So previously poor areas grew faster to close the gaps, and now there's been this switch towards regional divergence with successful areas growing faster, and it's affecting all kinds of things. It's affecting incomes, it's affecting markets, it's affecting jobs, entrepreneurship, productivity. So as you can tell, it affects a lot of things on both the micro and macro level. And it parallels what are increasingly, and I'll make this case, divergent prospects for workers in their households. That in fact, that the people who aren't doing very well continue to struggle and struggle more than they did previously. I also think that the political economy of this is actually quite interesting. And 2016 was a remarkable year in a lot of different ways. The Brexit vote, obviously, I think took people quite a bit by surprise. And it was largely a regional election, as we have colleagues here who've done superb work on restructuring. And as it turns out, the struggling restructuring regions basically managed to pull off a narrow yes vote on leave over post-industrial regions like London, like the major metropolitan areas. And that was pretty remarkable, and I think it surprised a lot of people. The irony, of course, also is, as particularly Phil McCann and Raquel Arguelles-Ortega, is one of these days you're going to have to. I'm still working on it. The other part of it is that the irony is that the places that voted to leave are the ones that are going to be most affected. All right, they're the ones who are most. London, surprisingly, is not going to be terribly affected. So that Trump victory, I was actually in Vietnam at the time, and I was teaching a bunch of very bright undergraduates. And of course, whenever you're outside the country, you are the representative for your country. So my political leanings are in the opposite direction, and I was faced with 2 hours worth of questions and answers from some very talented Vietnamese students about what happened to my country. And the irony is that they were the ones most affected. If you remember Trans-Pacific Partnerships, TPP was the one that went down. But they were sorry for me. They were more sorry for me than they were for themselves. What happened was we have an electoral college system, without going into detail, which has a massive advantage for more rural areas. And more rural areas are the ones that are being left behind. I did my dissertation on West Virginia, which is one of those classic states that used to be Democrat and now has changed to Republican. And the point is that I got to know those folks back in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's one thing to watch yourself struggle. It's a whole other thing that another generation later, your kids are struggling even more, okay? It's a protest vote. It really was. People were tired. So that West Virginia example is something that remains with me. So this divergence is occurring in the midst of relative devolution, which is interesting. It's already been occurring in the United States and more recently in England. So this widening gap between places is occurring exactly at the same time that more places also have to take care of themselves. So in other words, poor areas don't have the resources necessary to essentially occur. U.S. devolved economic policy, we've always had more of a federalist system, all right? But there was this new federalism with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, which really substantially changed the trajectory of decision-making, moving decisions from D.C., from the capital, to states, regions, and communities. The UK is more recently stepping into devolution, and what's neat is that I'm in the home of one of the notable leaders in that respect, along with Manchester and with London, that really have taken devolution to a long way. As we noticed, Brexit has huge regional effects, mostly in leave areas, which makes the area question more important. It also parallels the geographic mismatch of Trump policies. The people who voted for Trump actually are the ones who probably are losing out most on his policies. And so I think the parallels are actually pretty remarkable. Winner regions meshing with winner businesses. So there's regions that win and regions that lose. There's also big winners in terms of business, and I think the two are related. It surprised me, and I talked to Simon about this, it surprised me that the book The World is Flat, who people might remember, Thomas Friedman, is only 14 years old. It came out 2005. If anything, the world has gotten less flat. It has gotten spikier. The places that are rising are rising fast. And what this translates into is what's known as market power, and that market power creates profits, a lot of them, and sustainable, rising the largest firm. This is especially true in the technology sector. And that's supposedly the area which was going to flatten the world, right? IT was going to flatten the prospects for everyone. But what's happened is that the leaders, such as Google and Facebook, have this network power, basically. This network market power, their networks are basically allow them to have a huge comparative advantage and maintain that comparative advantage because of the network, the built-in network structure. And IMF recently did an interesting study and took a look at the margins, basically, of firms across 19 OECD countries. And margins are basically up. So the pricing over costs are basically, rough proxy for profits. They've been up 8% from 2000 to 2015, but even more so for the top 10% of firms, the margins have gone up by 30%. So that suggests that there is market power and is being used, all right? Now the top firms are 50% more profitable than the rest. That's not surprising, but they also, as it turns out, give less of their share to the workers, okay? Now this comes at a time where the Chicago School of Efficient Markets, I went to Berkeley, and they were along with MIT, folks who were thinking about the Chicago School of Efficient Markets, which basically doesn't accept that this premium exists. If there's profits, there's going to be competition, it'll get competed away. All right, that's the traditional view. But what happens is that that efficient market hypothesis remains out there, although I think is increasingly discredited. And that's somewhat of a personal point of view, but I think the evidence doesn't hold up. And that's what I thought about, when I felt really fortunate to be at Berkeley, where Oliver Williamson and George Akerlof were, and et cetera, where they were noting that all it took is you could take those efficient market models and just tinker them just a little bit. And particularly, I'm going to talk about information and incentives, and what they can do is just a little grist in the mill can actually change the outcomes tremendously. All right, and the classic case most recently that everybody recognizes is the hazardous incentive of too big to fail. Economists call it moral hazard, and I'm not going to define it here, but there was this hazardous incentive of the banks basically knew that they were backed up. that they were too big to fail. The entire economy was hanging in the balance. And that incentive, that little incentive changed, basically created the largest recession since the Great Depression, all right? So why do I care about this? Well, because what's happening is if these firms were actually innovating and actually distributing, I think that innovating and distributing and creating jobs, I would be less concerned about it. But one major part of my research agenda is in entrepreneurship. And people don't recognize that small firms are actually the ones that are the job machines. And that's particularly true in the United States. The majority of net job creations are by firms that are younger than 5 years and have fewer than 10 employees. So it's not Google, it's not Apple that are hiring. They're hiring plenty of workers, but the real net job creation is occurring on the ground, below the radar screen. The other, this came out recently, is that this is a somewhat more troubling, is that average labor productivity growth actually goes to about 0 in firms older than 5 years. They're not innovating, they are not creating the margins, they are not creating the new. And why is this happening? Entrepreneurs, I believe, strongly influenced by David Aldrich in this case, Marianne Feldman, is entrepreneurs, I believe, are key conduits of innovation. And in particular, what I think they're doing is they're testing and probing diverse range of market frontiers. The idea is, I mean, these market frontiers for car hires, for instance, there's a frontier there, and as firms show up, they just keep pushing that frontier, see what works, see what doesn't work, for instance, okay? And that's exactly how innovation takes place. It occurs through those entrepreneurs, and it comes back to Schumpeter of creative destruction, which many of you will recognize. The problem is that the financial crisis hastened the decline. They were already declining, and the entrepreneurs and startups have been declining over the long term in the United States for quite some time. And the Great Recession made that considerably worse. Why? Because it was a financial crisis. So they yanked back on loans, particularly to riskier loans to small businesses, all right? So what you're getting is, as opposed to inclusive growth, what everybody is talking about these days and seems to be a goal, is actually you're getting exclusive growth. Some people really are winning, and it's not including everyone, all right? And that is manifested in both the UK and the US, that wage and income rebound are remarkably weak. Profits are tremendous, but wage and income rises are just barely above inflation. And that is in fact troubling. So again, entrepreneurship, job creation, productivity, all adversely affected by market trends. What we call dynamism, openings and closings, and note that I'm talking about closings as well, are systematically decreasing and regionally diverging. Okay, now openings make sense why that's important, but closings are important too. Why? Because they tell you what doesn't work. Okay, if I've gotten to know Birmingham a little bit in the 4 months that I've been here, it's amazing how quickly that has gone. But if I wanted to open up, if I was to think about a business, what would I do? I would take a look out in the market area and the market segment that I'm thinking about and see what's working out there. And then also see recently what didn't work out there, because it's important to understand what doesn't work as what does. And so dynamism is the key to innovation in that sense, with that pushing those market frontiers with successes and failures, what I call informationally illuminating, and I'll explain that in a little more detail, but basically lighting the way forward. This is what worked, this is what didn't. Let's snake our way through this and make it work into the most productive way possible. So here's the dynamism. What you'll notice is, okay, this is the cluster of all counties in the United States in 2004. And what you'll notice is it's a pretty remarkable turnover, that 10% of firms every year roughly out of existing establishments either open or close, okay? And it's pretty high when you think about it. And the average survival rate of firms is basically, over 50% die within the first 5 years, okay? It is a struggle. That's part of the reason they're innovative. That's the part of the reason they keep pushing the market frontiers. And you'll notice it's a fairly tight pattern. Look what happens a decade later. Now all of a sudden, originally the center point was about 10%, now it's down to 8%. Each, okay? The cluster is centered around 8%. That's a pretty big change in only 10 years. We're talking literally millions and millions of firms, okay? And you'll notice that as opposed to this nice, neat little pattern, you've got all kinds of divergence going on. You've got places that are diverging in a really big way, okay? Now here to give you an idea spatially about mapping, this is the dynamism, the gross rate of establishment openings and closings very substantially across space. And the idea is if you take a look, and the laser pointer may or may not be useful here. But you'll notice that the West in general, the South, this is St. Louis, the metropolitan area, this is Chicago, the eastern seaboard basically in Florida, high amenity places on the coasts, And then, I'm from Colorado, and Colorado, right when you get to the mountains, these are the farms, and you'll notice that the farms are where a lot of the lack of dynamism is. Again, this is adjusted for population, all right? So it's not just true that bigger cities have more dynamism, but the fact is, even accounting for the small size, San Francisco is much more dynamic, Denver, Colorado is much more dynamic, and so on. So that's what that picture looks like. What about the UK? This is UK, or basically Wales, Scotland, and England. And you'll notice that, not surprisingly, that London and the southeast area is a big hotspot. You'll also notice that the West Midlands is interesting in that it has several hotspots. But it also demonstrates, one of the things I've been learning relatively recently, is that there is a southeast versus northwest divide. And you see that quite clearly here, right? And that basically in the southeast you have a lot of heat, basically a lot of dynamism going on, where in the north there's much less. Here's the trend that I've been talking about, and again, it's been occurring over since about 1980, 1977, and basically openings went from about 16% all the way down now to about 10%. That's a huge cut in terms of openings, and both openings and closings are decreasing systematically in the U.S. Now, the UK is relatively more stable, but it has a lot of variability. Okay, it is a relatively entrepreneurial culture, something that I'm beginning to take a look at with the help from several folks in this room. But there are reasons to believe that dynamism, and as it turns out, dynamism does have an effect here too, and that variability has a lot of effect in terms of the divergence that we were talking about. So from inequality from people to places to nations, what I'm linking here now is the work that Thomas Piketty in particular did, and we know the capital in the 21st century, 20th, 21st centuries. And what he basically posits and shows is that there's increasing returns to capital, basically holders of assets, relative to labor. So that means people who already have assets are gaining more, okay? And he, even just in terms of income now, in those 25 years, 80 to 2014, the bottom 50% gained only 21% of income. The top 10%, 113, the top 1%, 1.94. It's a pretty remarkable statistic. And what does it look like globally? This is the global growth, okay? And what you'll notice here is that the bottom 50% captured even less of total growth, all right? Now you'll say, what about China and India? I mean, they've been doing relatively well. Well, that's this hump right here, okay? Those folks have been doing, these are the rise of the emerging countries. But then it slopes down, why? Because this 90%, you'll notice that this is basically off-scale, sort of log scale towards the end, that this portion right here is the squeezed bottom 90%. Meanwhile, the prosperity of the global 1% captured 27% of the global growth, all right? So what's known as the elephant curve. Yes, thanks, Masi. If you haven't taken a look, Raj Chetty and Emmanuel Zatz, Chetty's at Stanford and Zatz is at Harvard, at Berkeley. If you haven't had a chance, go to opportunityinsights.org. They have done a remarkable job using the very fine micro-level data using tax returns, so it can get very much at this. And what they basically discover is, controlling for everything you can imagine, and they can, that the place of birth and residence fundamentally determines lifelong economic prospects. And that's troubling, because that means that if you're stuck in an area, if you're from an area that's struggling, the chances of your struggling are very high, all right? It's what's known as path dependence. So this idea that inclusive growth is going to be important is gaining some traction. And I talked about rural-urban as an example. That's one of the things that I study. It's one of the things that we're doing in collaboration to think about the UK. But the idea is that is a very simple but already fairly straightforward way of thinking about this inclusivity, that rural areas in the United States, for instance, are not included in this growth. And you even have a lot of skeptics, Larry Summers, Ed Glazer, Richard Florida. They were largely urbanites. They basically said that all you need to do is to make sure that everybody just migrates to the city, all right? That's not a solution, particularly in an era where migration is in fact declining, all right? People are not moving as much. And in Europe, they have always moved even less, okay? They're now acknowledging that place matters, and that really we actually need to worry about these lagging regions. Don't be complacent anymore, and they've been acknowledging it. These are big folks who've been thinking about this. And Paul Krugman won the Nobel Prize in part for the fact of his identifying economic geography as an important area of knowledge gaps that can actually be put to use, like what we're talking about. So I think place really does matter, and I think spatial economics adds that link between the micro foundations, the markets, the car hires, for instance, the market for oranges, the market for whatever, and the macroeconomic outcomes, basically national income, unemployment, inflation. Okay, why? Well, first of all, every individual's decision as a firm, as a household, what it does is it creates the region, all right? Your decisions, whether you decide to work, where you decide to work, whether you decide to commute, whether a firm decides to hire, to invest in capital equipment, that basically shapes your regional economy, okay? It's a local situation. And so the macro outcomes are really just the sum of regional outcomes. So the range of regional economic outcomes, the sum total, as you sort of stack these up, what they do is they determines the trajectory of the national economy. And that is important. Why? Because if a national economy wants to grow, the idea is having as many regions included as possible seems to be a worthwhile goal. And that's where I think the connection comes in. So regional economies are the context. Why? Because you're limited somewhat by commuting. I know people in this room commute an hour, 2 hours, sometimes by train. But that's still ultimately you're thinking about. It's a labor market. Because your partner, you have a house. This is going to be the decisions that you're going to make, and it's going to be very focused on a particular place, and that shapes longer-term macro performance. And in turn, the macroeconomy has differing effects on households, firms, and regions. And one example of that is what's known as resilience. That different places were more resilient to the economic shock of the Great Recession. Those places, not surprisingly, that struggled before, struggled even worse. All right. And again, largely because of that entrepreneurship. So here's where Dr. Akerlof was really influential, and this is sort of the red thread that runs through much of my work. And this wouldn't be as much of a problem, except there's an embedded market failure. There's an embedded imbalance that I think is really problematic. So quietly embedded in places are what I know as information imbalances. The technical term is information asymmetry. And imbalances, the difference in information between one place and the next, this is part of the conditions for an efficient market, can cause markets to quote unquote fail. And what they mean by fail is you're basically leaving money on the table, all right? And marginalized regions remain marginalized. That's not just bad for the region, it's bad for the national economy, all right? So Akerlof used, it's interesting. I mean, he's one of these cases where his Lemons paper was rejected at about a dozen different journals. And so it eventually QJE eventually published it. And what you have is he used used cars, and the used cars are useful because they're experience goods. In other words, you don't know the quality of a car until you've had a chance to drive it around. It's a buyer-seller problem. The seller, for instance, if you have a good used car, what are you going to say is the quality of your car? It's a good car, right? If you have a lemon or a bad used car, what are you going to say? Well, you'd like to get the most money for it, so you're going to tell them it's also a good used car. And the problem is that there is no way for somebody, just at face value, to make an instant decision and who's telling me the truth here. And what it does is it's going to push away good used cars. Why? Because people with good used cars don't want to sell at a loss, and people who are trying to buy, they're afraid of getting a lemon. And by being afraid of getting a lemon will not pay as much money for the average car, okay? So determining quality, and that's really what's happening here, is with limited experience is hard. And this is why experience matters. Cars are experience goods, so are places, all right? Regions themselves are places that have experience. And what I talk about is what is known as thin information markets. And particularly in rural areas or deindustrializing areas, these are the places that are particularly affected by this. Thin information basically means there's a lack of dynamism, that there's not much economic activity, all right? Lower dynamism means fewer data points. And for those, a very simple statistical relationship shows that even if the project probability, you've got a great idea and the probability of it succeeding in a rural versus an urban area is exactly the same, if a rural area has fewer data points, it looks riskier, all right? And that risk is going to be a problem, and because this higher uncertainty deters buyers. Everybody from investors to potential entrepreneurs to creditors to insurance, all right? That's a problem, and that premium exists. And effectively, it both effectively and inefficiently pushes away good projects. Because the idea there may be good projects out there, but the idea is that just by having the opaqueness of the market, the thinness of the market doesn't allow you to see it. And a term that's come into parlance for the global economy, particularly for the United States, is the secular stagnation. Larry Summers was the former president of Harvard and the head of the World Bank for quite some time. And what he has been thinking about, and this is what sort of was a change for him, was that there's secular stagnation, that stagnation is actually becoming embedded. And I think it's partially this explanation, although he doesn't touch upon it, I think is one of the rationales of why that's in fact occurring. Thin market uncertainty deters projects, it reinforces market thinness, so you get this place-based entrenching of economic inequality and inefficiency. All right. To illustrate this, let me talk briefly. Some of you folks who've been around economists know this, but let me. There's no $20 notes on sidewalks. Why would there? What is $20 pound? $20 20-pound note on the sidewalk? You don't see them very often, right? Well, and the idea is why? Well, very simply, somebody would have picked it up, right? And so you have two people. This is true. Let's say that you're talking about this could be a sidewalk. Could be a sidewalk in the middle of Birmingham, right next to the train station. But it could also be a sidewalk, as we discovered in this jewelry quarter, which can be during the weekend very, very quiet, as it turns out. We were kind of astonished as to how much. And the idea is that $20 notes, 20-pound notes on sidewalks don't exist. 20-pound notes. But the fact is that if there's no constraints and no spillovers, there's no bills on the ground. That's the efficient free market. That's Chicago picking up those 20-pound notes, okay? But the problem is that you need somebody to test the sidewalk. You need somebody to try, because otherwise that 20-pound note may stay there, all right? So the information on thin market viability is poor, so the market ends up failing. And here's the problem, is that you need a pioneer, okay? And I've looked at this for redeveloping areas in old industrial districts, for instance, but it's also true in rural areas. The problem is that you need somebody to try it, okay? Now, the thing is, if someone tries it, you have a pioneer, she moves first. If she fails entirely alone, okay? The problem is if she uncovers a viable new area, like lower downtown Denver, it's a reindustrializing old warehouse district that's done tremendously well. Somebody, in fact, our former governor, now running for the US presidency, John Hickenlooper, was one of the ones, was a pioneer who basically put a brew pub in an area that was seriously dilapidated, all right? And what happened was, they succeeded, but the problem is that the moment that happened, sure, that's great, except the pioneer just absorbed the risk for everybody who's going to follow behind them. And now he has a whole ton of competition, as it turns out, because now there's only about 20 brew pubs in the local area, okay? That's a problem. So what I do is take a game theoretic approach to assess this first mover challenge, and the idea is that sidewalks must be tested. And if losses are larger than early profits, the basic idea is the brief time that you can capture this, and losses can be pretty large, you can show fairly clearly that no pioneer will move first. So market underprovides investment to struggling areas. You have limited information, you limit growth, you limit information, it becomes this stagnation cycle. And this is what, the nice thing about this, and the reason why I'm excited about this agenda, is that it's rare in economics. We always talk about trade-offs. It's a one big cost-benefit analysis, right? And particularly between equity and market efficiency. Improving equity is great, but it may be at the cost of market efficiency. What you're talking about here is looking at marginalized places, in other words, improving equity, reducing inequality, actually increases market efficiency because you're actually getting projects that wouldn't have been undertaken otherwise. So what do we do? Okay, great. So academics are really good at outlining problems and then tossing out their hands. So what I like to believe is that this is the university in the 21st century, which is why I'm particularly glad about having the panel that we do. Information, I believe, is a university's core competence. If universities do anything, they provide information on a wide range of areas of fields. So if information is the key gap, universities are ideally placed. It's a modern role. It's the idea of bridging these informational gaps may be really valuable. Now, universities, a good chat with Simon about the land-grant universities, for instance. There's a tradition of land-grant universities. As it turns out, I didn't realize there's land grants actually to each one of these colleges and schools here in the UK too. But the idea is that that land grant that was made by Abraham Lincoln shortly before the end of the Civil War, the Morrill Act, basically provided a huge chunk of land for universities to start. And that was the state schools, the A&M schools. Colorado State is the land grant for Colorado, for instance, all right? And those land grants are in fact tied to regions. They are the ones who are supposed to be engaged in the regions and informing households, firms, and policy on choices, trade-offs. So City-REDI is a great case in point. We have a colleague who now is celebrating 30 years of his own very successful regional economics application laboratory at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. In fact, he's listening in as we speak. Hey, Jeff. Yeah, there he is. So the idea is to highlight the potential economic win-wins. The more information on marginalized regions' opportunities or neglected opportunities in West Midlands reduces inequality, improves the broader economy, and helps overcome what they call this path dependency of stagnation cycle. The problem is otherwise you get stuck in this cycle of stagnation. So I'm just going to quickly, my own work, just to briefly review it, is I've tried to do applied research that tries to inform. I like using cutting edge techniques, but there's plenty of good real world problems out there. That's the fun of engagement. That's the fun of being out there, because it's fun to try to sort of try to solve the problems that are out there. That's why I got an interest in economics in the first place. So very briefly, like I was talking about, I have a game theoretic entrepreneurial pioneering move that models the thin market risk and uneven first mover incentive. So basically that sets up a theoretical reason why you're going to have pioneers. Methodology to value information. So what is university's actual contribution? I came up with a technique to do that. Natural experiments in information signaling, seeing drops of information. If you suddenly provide some information in an area, what happens? In terms of local economics outcomes. For those who are interested in finance, we've actually looked at employment risk and returns. You can talk about a portfolio, an economic portfolio replace, and talk about risks and returns and migration responses, so people moving. Entrepreneurship and inclusive growth. People don't start companies hiring 100 people. That's one of those little fallacies. Everybody wants to have the smokestack, the big industry, but what the reality is, the job creation comes from the little ones. And nobody starts a company with employees, because as you folks probably know, hiring employees is somewhat of a pain. It's costly, there's a monitoring cost, that sort of thing. So most businesses start as self-employers. It's you and me and a partner. And those are the ones that, when they're successful, they grow. They're the ones who employ folks. That also ends up, those hirings end up determining the income distribution and inequality. Housing inequalities. As it turns out, housing can really matter. Home ownership gives you a piggy bank, right? But the problem is, what about renters? Okay, places with high home values also have high rental rates, and that may be constraining entrepreneurship. We've done work on social networks, gender and glass ceilings, the networking involved. We've looked at banks, lending and firm survival. And this bank performance, one of the fun branches that we've done recently is that we found that, particularly among bigger banks, that as you know, there's been a huge amount of consolidation in the American banking system. And in some ways, the financial crisis hastened that. But the interesting part is that those big banks with far-flung networks recovered much more slowly. Why? Information. The idea is that Chase in New York has very little idea of what's going on in rural Colorado. Yet it's going to be a Chase branch that is going to make a loan decision. And we've shown that empirically. Community banks, in fact, strengthen local economies. And now this is a project I'm working with colleagues here at City-REDI, inclusive growth, rural-urban divide in the US and UK. We believe there is a rural-urban divide in the US. Let's take a look at it in the UK, all right? I believe that part of the reason I'm excited to be here is I think that the University of Birmingham and City-REDI are actively on the cutting edge. These are just a couple of the most recent work that's been going on, in addition to all the Brexit work that we just discussed. There's an advanced regional modeling being built right now of the economy, taking a look at structural snapshots, and then also how do you foster regional growth and dynamism over time. For example, highlighting under-resourced opportunities for women and minority entrepreneurs. This picks up on a theme that I've been working on in the United States, is it's an untapped resource. Women entrepreneurs are actually remarkably entrepreneurial, but they have much more clear ceiling. They can't grow beyond a certain size because of the constraints of networking. So we have this number of workshops. Just for example, this is typical full calendar for City-REDI. Regional economic modeling, implications for UK and West Midlands will be in 2 weeks. We have a range of talks on growth, entrepreneurship, and policy, which I sort of include here. And then social networks and connectedness is going to be in June, thanks to a collaboration with the University of Illinois. So what? Many possible, what basically I've been arguing here is that there's a lot of different regional situations. They're fluid, they matter. For dynamism, for resilience, for business and worker choices. Yes, macro policies, interest rates, fiscal policy do matter to shape each region's trajectory. But regions themselves, I think, are a neglected channel for thinking about inclusive growth. Because like I said, if you take a look at marginalized regions, you automatically are being inclusive, reducing equity, and improving chances for projects. So place-based policy, which used to be, this term hardly existed just a few years ago. Place-based policy is now something that a lot of people are acknowledging happening, particularly in an era of decreasing migration and firm dynamism. So they may play a crucial role. So what are the challenges? Well, time. I'm first to admit academics are often really slow at responding to front burner issues. Now, again, I'd like to point again to Brexit and the Brexit work. I think that's the amount of information that's being done by folks at City-REDI in Sheffield on informing the public and informing Europe exactly what the regional implications are really important. There's traction. I mean, how do you get people to pay attention? So simplify and distill information to expand the range of audiences. Why should people care? You need to motivate that. But on the other hand, we also have some opportunities. Technology now, both in terms of input, in terms of the data that you can get, but also in terms of being able to disseminate, tech can provide real-time data and faster responses by leveraging social media. She's been terrific. Hang in there. I'm almost done. Last slide. Regions as complements rather than competitors. This is the pace that I've been making in the United States, and I think West Midlands is a great example. Generally, it's seen as a zero-sum game. It's everybody, it's one pie, and if I don't get a slice, it means I'm taking a slice. If I don't get a slice, it means the slice goes to somebody else. But I think that's too simple. It's a question of growing the pie, not just splitting it up. All right? So it's not urban versus rural, but rather urban and rural. There are advantages to both. In West Midlands, thinking about Birmingham and the West Midlands as a coordinated set, I think is really important. So pool regional assets, strive for those win-wins. Now, I come from a state, and because of the land grant school, I know California well. I grew up in the Silicon Valley in the 1970s, 80s. Palo Alto used to have apple orchards. Phil and I have some fun recollections about Palo Alto, the way it used to look. And it really is a new California. I mean, in terms of job growth, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of income growth, it's been tremendous. But it occurs entirely within a narrow corridor about 70 miles long and about 10 miles wide, right along the mountains. It's gorgeous. We live within a mile of the Rocky Mountains. The rest of the state, though, is actually unusually poor and has remained so. And it's true that entrepreneurship has been a major driver in terms of innovation. Now, the risks now are showing up. They didn't think they were California. I used to joke that they didn't understand traffic when I first got there. I got there about 25 years ago. They now understand traffic. I can tell you that. I know I have some relatives in Southern California. Those freeways are legendary. We're getting close. We are getting remarkably close. And so what's happening with this growth is you get this double-edged sword. You get great growth, but then all of a sudden you get infrastructure pressures, all right? Things like roads and highways, and cost pressures. Housing prices are becoming really high, okay? It's pricing out a lot of exactly the people that you might need, all right? And so I've been working with the Denver mayor, and it's fairly rare to have a mayor of any sort talk about sharing growth. They like growth. But the Denver mayor is actively talking about, we need to spread this out, okay? It's a win for us, it's a win for them, okay? And what we're focusing on is what they call this location-neutral entrepreneurship. And the idea is using IT, the internet backbone. Colorado has just put a huge amount of money to basically connect every rural household to high-speed broadband, which is a major state initiative. It's something you can do. Topography is difficult, but it's a major initiative, and it's a way of leveling the playing field. And the idea is that allows much more easily, because there's a lot of activities that don't have to be done right in the middle of Denver, that the front-range dynamism can flow to the rural Colorado. So I think there's similar regional collaborative possibilities that are occurring right now, thanks to many people in the room in the West Midlands. Universities and City-REDI inform on opportunities. We can bridge those informational gaps into lagging regions. Efficiency and equity, coming back to that, it is, for those who don't do economics, it's probably not quite as clear cut, but the fact is that those are always in tension. The fact that economic win-wins, where you can reduce inequality and improve the market, that's rare, and I think it's all the world worth pursuing. Thank you.
That's great. I'm sure we've got lots of questions. Before we hand over to questions, though, we've got a couple of commentators. Oh, right.
I'm determined. Yeah.
This is for you. We've got a couple of commentators who are just going to make a short contribution, if that's okay. So we start with Professor Simon Collinson, who's Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor, Regional Engagement at the University and Director of City-REDI. Simon, do you want the microphone?
No, I don't think I need it. I think people can hear me. I can usually get my message across in the lectures. So thanks very much, Kathy. A big thanks to Stephan. It's been wonderful having him hosted at City-REDI. He's been such a contributor. I've learned a huge amount. In particular, what strikes me about this is what is similar and what is different about the UK context and the US context. I think what is so striking is this polarisation that we've got going on. It's political, with Trump and with Brexit, but it's also so clearly economic. And what Stephan brings to bear here is some really clear data as evidence for this polarisation. This last decade has been unprecedented in terms of the divergence, and those who are winning more and more, and those who are losing more, so it spills over from the economic to the social. When it comes to differences, though, and I'll be very brief, but it does strike me, the question we come to at the end is policy, which City-REDI is very concerned about. the question is, what do you do about this? If you see the pattern, what are the intervention points? What are the catalysts to change these trends? And I'm really struck by one difference we have, which is the institutional, the governance difference. Because the policy machines that exist in the US through a state system, a federal system, a state system, and actually quite a strong mayoral system, is something that the UK has lost probably over the last 20, 25 years. And it's lost it in the sense that we have become the most centralised of the OECD advanced economies in terms of decision-making, institutional power, and the funding of who decides what policies apply where. So London, believe it or not, is far more centralised than Paris or any of our European cousins, and far more centralised than the US system. Decisions are made at the centre, and I'm talking explicitly about the English regions, and the finance, the funding, the capability, and the institutional forms that are needed to intervene, to customise interventions so that we put in place skills, entrepreneurship packages, science and technology development, policies that are right and appropriate for places, because place matters. We've lost a lot of that. And the problem we've got, I think, is one of re-energising regions, but doing that by re-energising policymakers to work with universities and firms with devolved power and more funding from the centre to enable and facilitate regionally appropriate place-based strategies. And I was excited about this up until Brexit. And Brexit seems to have rolled away some of the progress we were making around a narrative for devolved power. That's all rather negative. What encourages me, though, is the fact that Stephan's work shows how quickly you can turn this around and how quickly you can focus on the added churn you get from encouraging small firms, births and deaths, and reinvigorate a regional economy. And there's a lot of lessons that we can use from his work. So thank you again, Stephan. Really appreciate it. Good talk.
Thank you. And we've also got a commentary from Professor Richard Black, who's Vice Chancellor and Head of the College of Social Sciences. Richard?
So I will try to be brief, but again, thank you, Stephan, for such a stimulating talk. There was so much in what you had to say that I could have picked on any kind of 2-minute chunk of it and honed in on that and kept talking probably for another hour. So let me just pick on 2 things. One is just to stress the importance to me of this concept of the university as an anchor institution, which I think is now a mainstream understanding, at least in UK policy circles, is absolutely central to the way that the University of Birmingham envisages itself. In fact, the phrase anchor institution is written into our 2026 strategy, and of course it's also core to what we're trying to do in the College of Social Sciences. And what I take from your lecture is that one of the key things that we can be doing is collaborating rather than competing, and also working hard to bridge information gaps. So I take that away as a really positive reaffirmation of the model for what we do, not only in City-REDI but across the business school and indeed across the wider university. Just one kind of slightly more contentious thing. I trained as a geographer. In fact, I still consider myself a geographer. And I trained as a geographer at the height of the miners' strike in the UK. And we were taught at that time, and it was visible in our everyday experience, about the north-south divide and the concept of there being thriving regions and regions that were suffering from deindustrialization was a very current one at that time. And it seems to me that over the course of my professional career, that north-south divide has eroded to a degree, so Britain at least has become a little bit flatter, but that now we are definitely in a phase in which inequality is on the rise, and that north-south divide is rising, except that the north-south divide I see today in Britain is not the same as the north-south divide that I saw when I was studying as an undergraduate student. Amongst other things, Birmingham, the West Midlands region at that time, was still just about one of the thriving regions of the UK. It was a region in which you needed an industrial development certificate to be able to open a new establishment. So regional economic policy explicitly tried to prevent more business going into Birmingham. How different are we now, where Birmingham has some of the poorest and most, the West Midlands region has some of the poorest and most disadvantaged regions in the UK? And I was struggling in my mind to think of a counter-example of places that have done relatively well. I feel sure that there are some, but if I were to press you, it would be to reflect on the way in which the regional inequality we see now is not simply a reproduction of what we've had in the past, but there have been some important changes and why those changes exist.
Now, I realise you probably want to come back, Stephan, but I'm keen to open
Please,
it up.
absolutely.
Is that okay?
That's why.
So, colleagues, thank you, Richard. Thanks very much. Colleagues, anybody got any questions? And we've got the microphone here, which I think Charlotte's going to go around with. Colleagues, questions?
Hi there. Thank you for the talk, Professor. I just had a few thoughts regarding, you didn't specifically, as this gentleman touched on, the changing geography, as in the strengthening of London and how it's accelerated from past, or has it declined from previous? But I had some thoughts regarding, given the pivot to a service-based economy, isn't it just more beneficial, easier to have everything located in this, like the entrepreneurial hubs, the financial hubs, the accounting, and isn't it inevitable to see this kind of a concentration to London, New York, California, those kinds of areas?
There is what we call clustering of agglomeration economies. And yes, there are efficiency reasons, but there is also sort of tipping points here. And I think what London, and we don't have a place like in Paris, I guess, of course, even New York is not as central as London is in Minnesota. So yes, it does make a lot of sense, but it also causes, some real, again, some growth pressure, infrastructure pressures, housing prices. It's really extraordinary. And what you're doing is pricing a large number of people out. What happens in the Bay Area, for instance? So there is some good reasons to do this, but if people continue to pour into the Bay Area, despite the expect that the only people who pour into that area are people with food and resources, right? The people who service that, if you want restaurants, for instance, in San Francisco, there's known for big restaurants. Those cooks and waiters, I know for a fact, are commuting 2 hours in each direction from the Central Valley. That's not quality of life. And again, and this is where I think that London can continue to grow, but by parsing out certain activities that don't necessarily need to be the back office operations, things like accounting, there are some of these, but that doesn't need to be so centralized. South Dakota was a major case in point in the United States where the credit card companies were involved. And a lot of credit card companies actually went to South Dakota. Not many people know what South Dakota is, right? But it was very rural, and it was actually quite successful at this time. And the trading structures changed. So well taken, and there are some real instances. And people go after that, but the problem is that it also makes the world A, spikier, and B, I think it's to the detriment of the overall economy. Again, if London is growing, but in some ways at the cost of other regions, I think London can still grow while other regions can prosper from London, for instance. So you're absolutely right. I just think that we're hitting kind of a tipping point.
Hi, Stephan. Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. And I was wondering, it's a really big question, but from your work, have you come with a sort of taxonomy of what makes some urban areas successful, some unsuccessful, some rural areas successful, some unsuccessful? Because you think in the UK, you can have places like rural Wales, some of the poorest in Europe, or you can have these sort of leafy shires down in the south, very successful. You can have urban areas like the Black Country, really big problems, but you can have urban areas like Birmingham city centre doing pretty well. And what is going on there, they can be next to each other. They can be very similar, but they can have such different outcomes.
It's a great question. The United States, urban areas in general benefit from exactly the clustering economies. Generally, I like to keep things being equal. You move to a city, you get a wage premium. But in terms of the United States, one of the things we do have, it's a big country. And it's remarkably diverse. And if you're going to have, the United States got remarkably diverse, if you're going to take a swath of territory on the planet. It's not a huge country, but it has just about everything. We live in a really nice place, Colorado, and amenities matter. So in that sense, places that are nice, typical places that are along the seashore, you've noticed that pattern is very much. The Great Center, which actually has some of the lowest amenities, quote-unquote, natural amenities. It's not quite as true in Britain, because Britain is a relatively homogeneous, the weather report always comes on. There are differences in weather, but it's a pretty small place. But I think the alternative is also what, I think there's, and in some ways that suggests that places that don't have amenities, aren't going to against the lakes or oceans are always going to see. I don't think that's true. I think some cities survive and do well, even secondary cities in the United States. We've been looking over and notice these micropolitan areas, relatively small cities. And they found a niche, and it often has to do not with amenities, but something that can keep young people there, keep them interested. The internet is obvious, but and this is where the creative class idea, which I think has been too broadly stated, but the idea of having some activities, some various niche type activities, and I can point to a few cases where rural areas, for example, in terms of the arts, for instance, or to recreation or whatever, to basically, it's marketing yourself, and why should people stay there? When I was working at the Federal Reserve at the Center for Study of Rural America, that was a wonderful experience. I think the Federal wishes it had that center now. But one of the things that's hard to go into these communities is not all communities can survive. The pattern, the spatial pattern if you look at the United States is very regular across the Midwest. And part of that was because of the way the train system worked, right? You had 12 stops, about 12 miles each, for refueling. That no longer matters. The places that got big in time, they did relatively well. But not every small place is going to survive. But particularly secondary centers, they can be big enough. That's the real growth part. The part that's understated is the United States. That it's the medium-sized cities that are actually doing the market as well. And they're actually doing the ones most innovative too. So
I think we've got time for one last quite quick question. Finola?
And you mentioned the creative class and this is going to be
sure.
Very interesting. And so it's very interesting with Birmingham because there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's the same old thing about, it's going to get difficult because of property prices, the spaces that they don't have to live are being taken over property values, etc. And there was a very interesting debt piece that was called Be More Birmingham. It was great because it brought together the kind of business side of the art with the much more creative side of the art. And as always happens, there was severe tension in the room. So the kind of focus and excitement was around scale-up and IT exploitation and these stories of fabulous work we had. And the frustration was around people who are doing the bread and butter work and have kind of been invested, who aren't really included in the conversation. So I don't know if you have any models of places where maybe there's a balance. I've never found one, but
it's a good question. I mean, honestly, we'd love to live in, but we live in right near the mailbox. I mean, it's terrific. Denver is the analogy, and it's roughly around the same size. And they have a number of urban amenities. The redevelopment is working along the canals. We're doing a lot of what's going on in Denver around the river. And so, again, so living and having those amenities nearby is great. Who captures the returns is a problem. Creative class, again, creative class is a little bit, I'd like to focus more on the arts, particularly or recreation. And those folks don't always get there, as you know. And I think that is also why I think there's a public good nature to it. I think if you want to, there is a case to be made that certain occupations are ranked occupations. So I'd like to believe, as Simon was talking about resources, and those become resources. If you want entrepreneurs, one of our studies actually shows that using a very narrow definition of arts, not Richard Florida's relatively larger, but very narrow, just art as opposed to art, actually, in and of itself, actually spurs entrepreneurship. So there's actually real evidence of that. And I think we can use that kind of evidence. And that's part of what we try to do, is use the evidence, use the empirical evidence to show the way that we can control it.
Colleagues, there is entertainment afterwards, made by our your good selves. So we've got refreshments and a chance to talk and perhaps ask you a few more questions
Absolutely.
in detail,
All right.
Stephan, over a drink and conversation. So thank you all for coming, but I particularly thank you for our contributors, but I particularly want to thank you for a very stimulating talk, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions afterwards as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.